You can sit with me. 4 words. That's all it took to start it. Nobody at Kensington Elementary knew that yet. Not the lunch aide who looked the other way. Not the assistant principal watching from the doorway with his arms crossed. Not even the boy who said it. All anyone knew that Tuesday in October was that a 9-year-old walked across a cafeteria nobody else would cross, sat down across from a man the whole room was afraid of, and unwrapped half a sandwich to share with him. Nobody knew what that man had lost. Nobody knew what the boy had lost either, or that the two of them had been carrying the same kind of weight without ever having met. Nobody knew that by the end of that week, a 2-lane road in Erie, Pennsylvania, would be a river of chrome and leather, 500 engines deep, parked nose to tail for 6 blocks. For him. It didn't start with the motorcycles. It started 3 days earlier, with an empty seat. Ruth Bennett was awake before the sun, the way she'd been awake before the sun for 61 years. And she made Malik's lunch the way she always did, the way her daughter used to make it, God rest her. Scodwiches, not one. Why 2, Grandma? Malik had asked once, years ago, before he understood. One's for you, Ruth said, folding the wax paper the way Denise used to fold it, sharp creases, a little tuck at the end. Other ones for whoever's sitting by themselves. What if nobody's sitting by themselves? Then you eat good today. Ruth had smiled, but it was the smile she used when she was holding something back. But baby, there's always somebody. That had been Denise's rule, not Ruth's, Denise Bennett, who used to say it like scripture. Find the person eating alone. Sit with them first. Everybody remembers who sat with them first. She'd said it to Malik 100 times before the ice took Route 5 out from under her car 2 winters back, on a night Malik still couldn't think about without his throat closing. Ruth had picked up the rule where Denise left it, the way she'd picked up everything else. The mornings, the packed lunches, the parent-teacher conferences, a boy who used to talk in full sentences and now sometimes didn't talk at all. Malik was 9 now, in Mrs. Alvarez's 4th grade class at Kensington Elementary, and he still made the second sandwich every day whether Ruth reminded him or not. Peanut butter and honey, cut on the diagonal, wrapped in wax paper with the corners tucked. He didn't tell anyone why. It felt like a secret between him and his mother, something that still worked even though she was gone, like a phone line nobody had disconnected. He was quiet at school, not shy, exactly. Mrs. Alvarez had noted that in her file, actually crossed out shy, and written watchful. Instead, but quiet in the way of a kid who had learned that rooms could change without warning, that grown-ups could love you and still not be there in the morning, that safety was a thing you checked twice before you trusted it. He kept his shoes tied double. He kept 2 books in his backpack at all times, in case one ran out. He kept the second sandwich, every day, just in case. Nobody at Kensington knew that Malik Bennett read at an 8th grade level. That fact sat in a folder in the front office, buried under a form nobody had double-checked. Because on the first week of school, an intake specialist working through 91 new files in a single Tuesday had glanced at Malik's address, his free lunch status, and a note that said, recently relocated, family loss, and had checked a box. Group C, reading intervention, the remedial room, 3rd period, 4 days a week, with 6 other kids, and a worksheet packet about vowel teams that Malik could have finished blindfolded in 1st grade. He never said anything. He just did the packet, and then he read by The Hobbit under his desk with the packet on top of it, and nobody noticed, because nobody was looking. At recess that same week, a boy named Bradley Kessler had knocked Malik's backpack off the bench where he'd set it. Not hard, not quite hard enough to be an incident, just hard enough to spill his books into the wet grass and make the point that he could. Bradley was 11, a year older than the rest of the class from being held back, and he had a way of testing people that never quite crossed into anything a teacher could write up. A shoulder that found your shoulder in the hallway. A comment about free lunch pitched just loud enough for the right kids to laugh at. a habit of repeating things Malik said in a softer, mocking version of his own voice. His father sat on the district school board and mentioned it often enough that Bradley had learned, young, that consequences were a thing that happened to other families. Malik hadn't said anything that day either. He'd picked his books up out of the wet grass one at a time, dried the covers on his sleeve, and gone back to reading like nothing had happened, because he'd also learned, young, which fights were worth having, and which ones you just let roll off, and a shoved backpack didn't rate. A girl named Priya, who sat 2 seats over in Group C, and struggled with a stutter nobody had ever bothered to test around either, had watched him do it, and asked him afterward why he never got mad. Getting mad just gives him more to laugh at, Malik had told her, matter of fact, tucking his last book back into his bag. I'm not gonna hand him that. It was, Priya would say much later, the single most grown-up thing anyone had ever said to her on a playground, and she remembered it for years, long after she, too, had been quietly and correctly retested, long after Malik Bennett's name had become something people in that town said with a specific kind of warmth attached to it. That was the water Malik swam in on, the Tuesday the motorcycles came into it. Ordinary. Invisible. A boy carrying 2 sandwiches and a wound nobody had asked him about, in a school that had already decided, without meeting him, roughly how far he was going to go. Walter Combs had not wanted to come to the school that morning. He'd told Ray Solano as much, standing in the gravel lot outside the Iron Shepherd's clubhouse the night before, both of them still greasy from working on Ray's transmission. Send cheese, Walt had said. Send anybody. I don't do good with the little ones. You're the one with the reading program in your name, Walt. That's Danny's name, not mine. Ray's wife, Doreen, had been the one to actually build the thing, a retired school librarian who'd married into the club 30 years back and never once ridden a mile she didn't choose to, and who had looked at a grieving father one winter and told him, flatly, that grief with nowhere to go curdles, and grief with somewhere to go turns into something a person can live inside. Miles for reading had been her idea on paper and Walt's name on the volunteer roster in practice, and Doreen kept a spreadsheet of every school, every visit, every kid who'd asked for a specific book twice, because she believed, the way some people believe in scripture, that the smallest details were the ones that told you whether a thing was working. Ray hadn't pushed harder than that, because Ray had been at the funeral 6 years ago, had ridden lead on the procession, had watched Walt Combs, 58 years old, 30 years turning steel at the mill before his knees gave out, built like a door, stand at a graveside and not make a sound, not one, the whole service. Danny had been 24, a forklift, a bad chain, a Tuesday nobody saw coming, and in the 6 years since, Walt had turned his grief into the one thing he could stand to look at, kids who liked to read, the way Danny had liked to read, the way Danny used to fall asleep some nights with a paperback tented open on his chest like a little roof. Miles for Reading was the club's name for it. 6 chapters across 3 counties, 40-some members, showing up at elementary schools twice a semester to read out loud, hand out books, remind kids that grown men in leather vests could sit still for a story same as anybody. It had started as Ray's idea and become, without either of them saying so out loud, the thing that kept Walt upright. He still hated the actual visits, hated the front office, hated the badge they clipped to his vest that said visitor in red letters like he was a threat that needed labeling, hated the way teachers' faces did a specific thing when they saw him coming down the hall. Vest, boots, the gray in his beard, the tattoo on his forearm he'd gotten the week after the funeral, Danny's initials wrapped in a ribbon of ink. He hated the pin on his chest most of all, a small enamel robin, Danny's favorite bird since he was 6 years old, and obsessed with a picture book about one, because every time somebody asked about it, Walt had to decide, fresh, whether he had it in him to answer. That Tuesday, he had lunch duty. Nobody had explained to him what lunch duty for a Trias, Miles for Reading. Volunteer even meant Ray's scheduling was more heart than logistics. So Walt just found himself standing in the doorway of the Kensington Elementary cafeteria at 11:40 in the morning, holding a tray he didn't want, in a room built for 4-foot people, wondering who was going to tell him where to sit. Nobody did. He found an empty table at the far end, near the recycling bins, and sat down alone, and understood within about 90 seconds that he had made himself the most interesting and least approached object in the entire room. Kids glanced. Kids whispered. A teacher's aide near the milk cooler kept one eye on him the way you'd keep one eye on a stovetop you weren't sure you'd turned off. He'd been in that seat exactly 4 minutes when a man in a gray suit and a lanyard came through the double doors, spotted him, and made a beeline across the cafeteria like Walt was a fire that needed containing. "Sir." The man had a clipped, flat voice, the kind trained to sound calm while meaning the opposite. "I'm Mr. Foss, assistant principal. Can I ask what you're doing in here?" "Miles for reading," Walt said. "I'm reading to the 2nd grade after lunch. Ray Solano set it up with your front office back in. I'll need to see your visitor's badge." Walt tapped the badge clipped to his vest, 6 inches from Foss's face, red letters and all. Foss looked at it for a beat too long, the way a man looks at something he's already decided not to trust regardless of what it says. "We'll need you to wait in the office until the program starts. Cafeteria's not really—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Walt had heard the unfinished half of that sentence his whole adult life, in one form or another, and he'd learned a long time ago that finishing it for the other person never went anywhere good. "I'll just eat my lunch," Walt said, evenly, "and then I'll go wherever you need me." Foss's jaw did something small and tight. He glanced once around the cafeteria, at the empty seats around Walt's table, 6 of them, untouched, like Walt had a force field, and walked away without another word, already reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. That was the room Malik Bennett walked into 3 minutes later. 200 kids, and one grown man sitting by himself at a table for 8 in a cafeteria that had collectively, silently, decided he didn't belong in it. Malik didn't think about it the way an adult would have thought about it. He didn't weigh risk. He didn't clock the tattoo or the vest or the size of the man's hands. He clocked one thing, the only thing his mother's rule had ever asked him to clock: a person sitting alone. He picked up his tray. He picked up the second sandwich, still in its wax paper, still creased the way his mother used to crease it. And he walked the length of the cafeteria, past his own table, past the boy named Bradley Kessler who called out something Malik didn't quite hear and didn't turn around for, and set his tray down across from Walter Combs. "You can sit with me," Malik said. It came out a little formal, a little rehearsed, the way kids say things they've practiced inside their own heads first. Walt looked up. For a second he didn't say anything at all, because it had been a long time since anyone had walked toward him instead of around him, and something about the boy's face, steady, unbothered, already unwrapping a sandwich like the matter was settled, hit somewhere in Walt's chest that he hadn't expected to still be tender. "That an invitation," Walt said slowly, "or an instruction?" "Both," Malik said, and pushed the wax paper sandwich half an inch across the table. "You looked like you needed it." Walt looked at the sandwich. He looked at the boy. Somewhere behind him, he was aware of Grady Foss, standing very still, near the double doors, radio in hand, watching the two of them like he'd walked in on something he needed to write a report about. "I already got a lunch, son," Walt said, nodding at his own tray. "I know," Malik said. "It's not about the sandwich." He was 9 years old. He said it like he was 40. Walt Combs, who had not cried at his own son's funeral, who had gone 6 years without letting anyone pass the vest and the beard and the robin pin he never explained, felt his eyes go hot and had to look down at the table for a second before he trusted his voice. "No," he said finally, quiet. "I don't suppose it is." He picked up the sandwich half. He ate it. And for 11 minutes, in a cafeteria where nobody else had wanted to sit within 6 feet of him, Walter Combs talked to a 9-year-old about books, and robins, and a son named Danny who used to fall asleep with paperbacks tented on his chest, and Malik Bennett, for the first time in 2 years, talked about his mother, without his throat closing all the way shut. Neither of them noticed Grady Foss writing something down. The note in Foss's office that afternoon read, in its entirety, unscheduled/unsupervised contact between volunteer and minor. Monitor. He didn't show it to anyone. He filed it. Grady Foss had run a tight building for 6 years, ever since transferring in from a district resource officer post 2 towns over, and he'd built his whole philosophy on one word he used constantly, in staff meetings, in the parent handbook, in the framed sign behind his desk. Consistency. No exceptions, no gray areas, let's just see how it goes. He believed with the total sincerity of a man who has never had to test the belief on himself that firmness was the only thing standing between an elementary school and chaos, and that the moment you let one thing slide, you'd spend the rest of the year sliding. He'd been a good cop, once, or thought he had. 15 years on patrol before the knee injury pushed him into administration, and he'd carried the job over with him the way some men carry an accent. The flat voice, the note-taking, the instinct to read a room for threat before he read it for anything else. Nobody at Kensington had ever asked him to examine that instinct. Nobody had needed to. It had never once, in 6 years, cost him anything. He didn't think of himself as a man with a problem. He thought of himself as the only adult in the building willing to say the hard thing out loud. When he looked at the folder on his desk that afternoon, Bennett, Malik, Grade 4, Reading Intervention, Group C, Free Reduced Lunch, Guardian, R. Bennett, Grandmother, Note, Recently relocated, Family loss. He didn't see a boy who read at an 8th grade level and had never been asked to prove it. He saw a risk profile. He'd seen 100 like it, filed 100 just like it, and every single time, he told himself he was protecting the building. He had no idea, that Tuesday afternoon, that he'd just started a chain of events that would end with 500 motorcycles idling outside his front door. Mrs. Alvarez found out about the sandwich before she found out about the note. 2 girls at the next table over had told her at recess, giggling, not unkindly. Malik gave the biker man half his lunch, Ms. Alvarez, and they talked the whole time. And something about the image had stuck with her through the rest of the day, because Patricia Alvarez had been teaching 4th grade for 11 years and had learned to pay close attention to the things kids did that adults hadn't asked them to do. Nobody assigns a 9-year-old to comfort a stranger. He'd done it on his own. It made her look at Malik differently that week, not more carefully. Exactly, because she'd always been careful with him, but more curiously. On Thursday, during silent reading, she walked the rows the way she always did, and stopped behind his desk, and saw the intervention packet sitting on top of a paperback with a dragon on the cover, and the paperback was clearly the thing his eyes were actually on. Malik, she kept her voice light, what are you reading? He startled, the way kids startle when they think they're in trouble, and started sliding the paperback under the packet. It's okay, she said. I'm not going to take it. I just want to know what it is. He hesitated a long moment, weighing her, the way he weighed everything now. Then he pulled it back out. The Hobbit, he said. I'm on the part with the dragon. That's a big book for 4th grade. I read it already once. I'm reading it again. 'Cause I like it. Patricia Alvarez had a master's degree in literacy education and 11 years of pattern recognition, and something about the flat, unbothered confidence in his voice, no bragging in it, no performance, just fact, made the hair go up on her arms. She crouched down next to his desk. Can you read me a page? Any page. Just so I can hear you. He read her a page. Then, because she asked, he read her another one, from further in, cold, no warm-up, and stumbled over exactly nothing, And when she asked him what a word meant that she was fairly sure half the 6th grade wouldn't have known, he explained it correctly and then, unprompted, used it in a sentence about his own mother, and Patricia Alvarez had to excuse herself to the hallway for a minute before she could trust her voice, because in 11 years of teaching, she had learned there was a particular kind of anger that came from watching a system fail a kid, quietly, efficiently, on paper, with nobody ever having to raise their voice to do it. She requested a full reading reassessment that same afternoon. She flagged it urgent. She did not yet know that her request would land, eventually, on Grady Foss's desk, next to a note that already had the word monitor written on it in his handwriting, about a boy he had already decided, without meeting him twice, he understood completely. Walt came back the following Tuesday for the 2nd grade reading visit, and again the Tuesday after that, and each time he found himself, without quite planning it, drifting toward the cafeteria at 11:40, whether it was on his schedule or not. Malik was always there. He never made a show of it, never waved him over, never announced anything. He just left the seat across from him open and unwrapped a sandwich, and by the 3rd week it had simply become the arrangement, unremarked, the way real friendships settle into a shape without anyone deciding on it out loud. They talked about books mostly. Walt had never been much of a reader himself. Steel mill work didn't leave a man much room for it, he said, and besides, his eyes weren't what they used to be. But he'd started reading the Miles for Reading. Selections at night, alone, in the trailer he'd lived in since the divorce, just so he'd have something to say to the kids that wasn't rehearsed. He told Malik about a book with a robin in it that Danny used to make him read 4 times a night when Danny was 6. He told him, carefully, in pieces, over 3 separate lunches, that Danny wasn't around anymore, and Malik had listened to all of it without flinching, the way only someone who already understood could listen. My mom used to say, Malik told him one Tuesday, working the crust off his sandwich in a slow spiral, find the person eating alone. Sit with them first. Everybody remembers who sat with them first. Smart lady, Walt said. She was. Malik didn't look up. She died in her car. 2 years ago. Ice. Walt sat with that a second before he answered, because he'd learned, the hard way, that the worst thing you could do to a grieving person was rush past what they'd just handed you. I'm sorry, son, he said. That's a hard thing to carry at your age. You carry it too, Malik said. Not a question. Every day. Does it get lighter? Walt thought about lying to him. The easy, comforting lie. Sure it does, buddy. And decided the kid deserved better than that. No, he said. But you get stronger. Eventually you're carrying the same weight. It just don't flatten you the same way it used to. He nudged the robin pin on his vest with one thick finger. This was my boy's. I wear it so I don't forget what it cost me to still be standing here. Some days that's the whole reason I get up. Malik reached out and touched the pin. Just once. Careful, like it might be hot. I like it, he said. It's brave. Wearing the sad thing out loud instead of hiding it. Walt didn't trust himself to answer that one at all. It was on that same Tuesday, almost as an aside, that Walt mentioned the thing that would matter later. The thing that felt, in the moment, like nothing more than a proud old man talking. Malik had asked him what the vest patches meant, and Walt had walked him through a few of them. And near the end, tapping the largest patch on his back, the one with the club's crest, he'd said, "You know what that patch really means? It means if one of ours needs backup, don't matter what for, don't matter when, the whole state shows up. I've seen it happen for a funeral 4 counties over. 200 bikes showed up before the family even finished making the calls. That's not a threat, son. That's a promise. We don't leave our people standing alone." Malik had nodded like it was just a nice thing to know, filed it away the way kids file away most things adults tell them, and gone back to his sandwich. Neither of them thought about it again for 11 days. On a Wednesday in between, with Walt off-site at a different building for the week's miles for Reading. Rotation. Bradley Kessler had leaned across the lunch table and asked Malik, loud enough for the whole row to hear, whether his biker boyfriend was coming back, and whether that was the only kind of friend a kid like Malik could get. A few kids laughed, the nervous, following kind of laugh that isn't really about finding something funny. Malik hadn't answered. He'd finished his sandwich, his own, that day. He still hadn't started making the second one again, and walked his tray to the return rack without a word, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead the whole way. The lunch aide on duty that day, a young woman named Kayla who'd been on the job less than a year, had heard the comment clearly enough to feel her stomach turn, and reported it to Grady Foss that same afternoon, in writing, exactly as she'd heard it. Foss filed it without action. His note, dated that Wednesday, and sitting in Bradley Kessler's thin, largely empty disciplinary file, read, verbal, informal, no witnesses requesting formal report, monitor. The same word he'd used for Walt. He never called Bradley into his office. He never called Kayla back in to ask a single follow-up question. Bradley Kessler's father had been on the phone with the district twice already that semester about unrelated matters, a scheduling complaint, a request for a coaching assignment, and Grady Foss, without ever consciously deciding to weigh one family's comfort against another's safety, had simply let the file sit. Kayla mentioned it to Mrs. Alvarez in the staff room 2 days later, frustrated, not sure what else to do with it. I wrote it up. I don't know what happens to these things once they leave my hands. Sometimes nothing, Mrs. Alvarez said, and hated how true it sounded even as she said it. The reassessment happened on a Thursday, administered by the district's reading interventionist, Dr. Naomi Reyes, in a small testing room that smelled like dry erase marker and old carpet. It took 40 minutes. Dr. Reyes scored it twice, because the first score seemed like an error, and then a third time, because the second score matched the first and she needed to be sure she believed it. Malik Bennett was reading, independently, at a mid-8th grade level. He was 9 years old, in Group C reading intervention, working through a vowel teams packet designed for children who were, on average, 3 grade levels behind him. This is extraordinary, Dr. Reyes told Mrs. Alvarez that afternoon, in the hallway outside the testing room, still holding the scoring sheet like it might change if she set it down. This kid should be in the gifted literacy pilot, not intervention. This is one of the biggest reassessment gaps I've seen in 9 years doing this job. How did it happen? Mrs. Alvarez asked, though she suspected she already knew the shape of the answer, even if she didn't yet know the specifics. A rushed intake form, a checked box, a folder that got read for its zip code and its tragedy, instead of the boy attached to it. Somebody didn't look, Dr. Reyes said simply. That's how it always happens. They brought the reassessment to Grady Foss's office that same afternoon, both of them, together, because Mrs. Alvarez had learned in 11 years that some fights went better with a witness in the room. Foss read the scoring sheet without much change in his expression. Impressive, he said, in the flat voice he used for things he had already decided not to be moved by. But the gifted pilots cohort is set for the semester. 16 students, hard cap, board approved. We can revisit placement in January. Mr. Foss, he's been sitting in remedial reading for 6 weeks doing a packet he could have finished in kindergarten. Every day we wait is a day we're actively failing him. Every kid in this building has a story, Patricia. Foss set the sheet down, squared it against the edge of his desk. I've got 41 open files with a family loss flag on them right now. If I make an exception every time a kid's had a hard year, I don't have a placement system. I have chaos. Consistency is the only thing that's fair to everybody. This isn't about his hard year. This is about a testing error that put a gifted reader in the wrong room. That's not a hardship exception. That's a mistake we made, and we can fix it in 5 minutes. Foss's eyes flicked, briefly, toward the folder still sitting on the corner of his desk. Recently relocated, family loss, free reduced lunch. and something in his face closed, quiet and total, the way a door closes when a person has already decided which side of it they're standing on. "I'll take it under advisement," he said, which both women in the room understood, correctly, to mean no. "Can I ask you something?" Mrs. Alvarez said, standing now. "If this were Bradley Kessler's reassessment sitting on your desk right now, instead of Malik Bennett's, would you still be telling me the cohort's full?" Foss's jaw tightened. "That's not a fair question, Patricia." "No," she said. "It isn't. That's kind of the point." She left without waiting for him to respond, Dr. Reyes trailing behind her, both of them furious in the particular, exhausted way of people who had watched this exact scene play out before, in other buildings, with other kids' names on the folder. Grady Foss did not think of himself as the villain of that conversation. He genuinely, sincerely believed, with the total confidence of a man who had never once been forced to test the belief against his own choices, that he just protected the fairness of his system. He did not examine why the word fairness kept landing every single time on the side of keeping things exactly as they already were. He also did not mention, to either woman, the note still sitting in Malik Bennett's file. Unscheduled/unsupervised contact between volunteer and minor. Monitor. He had been keeping half an eye on the Tuesday cafeteria arrangement for 3 weeks now, and it had started to bother him in a way he couldn't fully name and didn't try very hard to. A grown man in a leather vest, alone with a 9-year-old, 4 Tuesdays running, no staff assigned to supervise it directly. He told himself it was a liability concern. He did not ask himself why it had taken him 3 weeks of watching a boy share his lunch before the word liability occurred to him, and not, say, the first time he'd watched Bradley Kessler's father walk unescorted straight past the front desk to pick his son up early twice a week. He was building toward something. He didn't think of it that way. He thought of it as being thorough. Ruth Bennett found out about the reassessment from Mrs. Alvarez on the phone that same evening, and she found out about Foss's answer in the same breath, and something in her, 61 years old, 22 of them spent working the cafeteria line at a different Erie school, before her knees gave out, a woman who had buried her only daughter and picked her grandson's whole world back up off the floor without ever once asking anybody for help, decided she was done being patient about it. She requested a meeting. Foss's assistant offered her 15 minutes the following Monday, squeezed between a budget call and a parent conference, and Ruth took it, because 15 minutes was 15 minutes more than nothing. She wore her good coat. She brought the reassessment scoring sheet in a manila folder and a stack of report cards going back to kindergarten, because she'd learned a long time ago that a black grandmother walking into a school office, unarmed with paperwork, was a black grandmother who could be talked past. She sat across from Grady Foss with her hands folded on top of the folder and said, "I want to understand why my grandson is still sitting in that room. Mrs. Bennett, I appreciate you coming in. The gifted cohort. I read the email. 16 kids, board approved, revisit in January. My grandson is reading Tolkien in secret under a vowel team's worksheet, Mr. Foss. In January, he'll have lost half a school year he's never getting back. I want to understand why that's the outcome you've landed on." Foss folded his hands, and something in his posture shifted into the register he used, Ruth would later realize. Specifically for parents he'd already decided not to be moved by. "I understand this feels urgent from where you're sitting," he said. "But I have to think about the whole building, not just one family's situation. And I'll be honest with you. Given everything Malik's had going on at home this year, the loss, the relocation, I think there's an argument that a slower, steadier placement actually serves him better than throwing him into an accelerated cohort right now. We have to be realistic about what a kid coming from that kind of situation can handle." The room went very quiet. Ruth had heard versions of that sentence her whole life. "That kind of situation," said in a voice that never quite finished naming what it meant, because it never had to. She had heard it about her neighborhood, about her daughter's single-parent household before Denise had even died. about her own accent when she was young. She recognized the shape of it instantly, the way you recognize a scar you've had for decades, and she felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. Say the rest of that sentence, Mr. Foss. I'm not sure what you mean. Yes, you are. A kid coming from that kind of situation. Finish it. What kind of situation is my grandson coming from? Foss's face colored slightly. I meant the grief, Mrs. Bennet. The instability. That's all. You didn't say instability. You said, that kind of situation. And you looked at his file when you said it, not at me. Ruth's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I raised a daughter in this city for 34 years, and I have spent 2 years raising her son alone since the ground opened up under both of us. And in 6 weeks in your building, my grandson has been read for his zip code and his loss and his lunch status instead of his mind. You had the scores in your hand, Mr. Foss. You held the proof in your own hand, and you still found a reason to say no. I don't think that's fair. I don't think you get to decide what's fair to me right now. Ruth stood and picked up her folder and did not raise her voice once, which somehow made it land harder than if she had. I am going to be back in this office, Mr. Foss, and I am going to keep coming back, and I would very much like it if the next time I sit in this chair, you have found a reason to say yes instead of a reason to say no. Because my grandson is watching how this building treats him, and he is 9 years old, and he is already learning the lesson. I would like him to learn a different one before it's too late to unlearn it. She left. Foss sat alone in his office for a long moment afterward, and told himself, with the specific, practiced ease of a man protecting something he'd never had to defend before, that she'd simply misunderstood him. He did not know that Malik had been sitting in the front office lobby the entire 15 minutes, waiting for his grandmother, close enough to the cracked door to hear every word. Malik didn't cry on the walk home. He'd gotten good at that, a specific, careful stillness he could pull over himself like a coat, learned in the 2 years since the ice took his mother off Route 5, a way of holding a feeling at arm's length until he was somewhere safe enough to put it down. Ruth noticed anyway. She always noticed. You heard that, she said. Not a question. Yeah. You know none of that's true, what he said about you. I know. Malik kicked a piece of gravel down the sidewalk, watched it skitter into the gutter. Doesn't feel like I know it, though. Feels like maybe he's right, and everybody's just being nice to me. Ruth stopped walking. She crouched down to his level, right there on Poplar Street, coat and all, and took his face in both hands. Baby, listen to me. That man looked at a piece of paper and decided who you were before he ever really looked at you. That is his failure. That is not a fact about you. That is a fact about him, and I need you to keep those two things separate in your head. Because a lot of people in this world are going to make that same mistake, and you cannot let their mistake become your truth. You hear me? I hear you. Say it back. His mistake, not my truth. Malik's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Ruth pulled him into her coat and held on until he was ready to keep walking. He didn't tell her, that night, that he'd stopped bringing the second sandwich to school the next 2 days. He didn't have the words yet for what he was feeling, something that wasn't quite giving up, but was close enough to it to scare him a little. A first, small flicker of the exact lesson Ruth had been afraid he'd learn, that reaching toward people cost something, and that the building was watching, and that maybe it was safer, for a while, to just eat lunch alone and keep his head down. Walt noticed the empty seat across from him on Tuesday and didn't say anything about it, not that day. He just left the seat open anyway, the way he had every Tuesday since the first one, and ate his lunch, and waited. The fight, when it came, wasn't Malik's fault, and everyone in the cafeteria that day would later say so, unprompted, without being asked, which was, in its own way, exactly the problem, because it meant the truth had never actually been in doubt. Bradley Kessler was 11, held back a year, the son of a man who sat on the district's school board and had a habit of reminding people of it, He'd been circling Malik for weeks in the low-grade, deniable way certain kids learn early. A shoulder check in the hallway that could pass for an accident. A comment about free lunch pitched just loud enough for the right kids to hear. A mockery of the way Malik sometimes still said his mother's name out loud without meaning to. On Thursday, in the lunch line, Bradley knocked Malik's tray out of his hands. Deliberately. 3 witnesses would later confirm. A flat shove to the elbow. And when Malik turned, more startled than angry, Bradley shoved him again, harder, into the tray return rack, and called him something that made the lunch aide's face go white. The lunch aide was Kayla. She was the same young woman who'd filed the written report on Bradley 2 weeks earlier, the one that had gone into a folder and stayed there, and she would say afterward, to anyone who asked, that she'd known exactly what she was looking at the second it started, because she'd already tried once to make someone listen. Malik didn't throw the first punch. He didn't throw a punch at all. He put both hands up to catch himself against the rack, and in doing that, his forearm caught Bradley across the mouth, and Bradley, who had started it, who had planned it, who had been circling for weeks, sat down hard on the tile floor with a split lip and immediately began to cry, loudly, in the specific performative way of a kid who understood exactly which adult was about to walk through the door. Grady Foss arrived 90 seconds later. He did not ask the lunch aide what she'd seen. He did not pull the 3 witnesses aside. He looked at Bradley Kessler sitting on the floor with blood on his lip, and he looked at Malik Bennett standing over him, breathing hard. And something in Foss's mind, trained on 15 years of reading a room for threat first, trained on a note in a folder that already said, Monitor. Trained on a district policy titled, Zero Tolerance. That he had built his entire professional identity around enforcing without exception. Did the fastest, laziest math a person in his position could possibly do. My office, Foss said to Malik. Now. He shoved me first. He shoved me twice. Ask anybody. We'll sort it out. Let's go. Nobody sorted it out, or rather someone did. The lunch aide gave a written statement that afternoon, confirming Bradley initiated contact twice before any response occurred. But the statement went into the same folder as everything else, and Grady Foss, operating on the zero-tolerance framework he'd never once questioned in 6 years, suspended Malik Bennett for 3 days for physical altercation, effective immediately, and noted in the same meeting, almost as an afterthought, that given ongoing concerns about appropriate boundaries with the Miles for Reading volunteer program, he'd be recommending the district suspend the cafeteria component of the program pending review. He used the word concerns. He used the phrase unsupervised contact. He did not use Walt Combs's name in the recommendation, not directly, but everyone who read it would know exactly whose vest and whose face he meant. Ruth got the call at the diner, where she'd picked up part-time shifts since her knees forced her out of the school cafeteria line. She left mid-shift without asking permission, drove to Kensington with her apron still tied at her waist, and sat across from Grady Foss for the second time in 8 days, and this time she did not sit quietly. You have a written statement in your hand right now that says that boy hit my grandson twice before Malik ever touched him, and you suspended Malik. The policy doesn't distinguish who initiated. Then your policy is broken, and you are hiding behind it instead of using the judgment God gave you, and we both know it. Ruth's voice had gone very flat, very controlled. The voice of a woman keeping something enormous, leashed by main force. 3 weeks ago, you told me my grandson's history made him a risk. Now a boy who's been baiting him for a month puts hands on him twice, and somehow my grandson's the one sitting home for 3 days, while that boy sits in class with a Band-Aid and a story he gets to tell however he wants. You want to explain to me how those 2 decisions aren't the same decision wearing 2 different hats. Mrs. Bennett, I'd ask you to lower your voice. I am not raising my voice, Mr. Foss. I am asking you a direct question, and I would like a direct answer. She stood. You are pulling that man's reading program over a sandwich. You suspended a 9-year-old for defending himself with his own arms. And you did both of those things in the same week you told me, to my face, that my family's made a straight A reading score something to be handled slowly. I want you to sit with that tonight, Mr. Foss. I really do. Because I don't think you're a cruel man. I think you're a careless one. And I think careless has cost my grandson more this month than cruelty ever could. Because at least cruelty knows what it's doing. She left before he could answer. It was, without either of them knowing it yet, the last conversation Grady Foss would have inside that office with the district's full confidence still behind him. Malik's father called that night from a truck stop somewhere outside Toledo, the signal cutting in and out the way it always did, and Ruth walked him through all of it standing on the back porch, so Malik wouldn't hear the tremor she couldn't quite keep out of her own voice by the third telling. Marcus Bennett was 34, 2 years widowed, 3 days from home, on a run that paid enough to keep the lights on and the mortgage current. And he hated, more than almost anything else in his life, the specific helplessness of hearing his son had been hurt from 400 miles away, with a trailer full of freight he couldn't leave behind. "I'll call the school first thing," he said. "I'll call every day till somebody actually talks to me instead of reading me a policy." "I've got it, baby," Ruth said. "You get home safe. That's your job right now. I'll handle the school." "You shouldn't have to handle it alone, Mama." "I'm not alone," Ruth said, and found, saying it, that she believed it more than she expected to. "Malik's got people in his corner I didn't even know he had. I'll tell you everything when you're home. Just drive careful. We need you here in one piece, not sped up an hour." She didn't tell him about the motorcycles. There wasn't a way to say it yet that wouldn't have sounded impossible over a bad connection at a truck stop in Ohio. She let him find out 2 days later, the way most of the town did. A video already circulating. 6 blocks of chrome parked outside his son's school, and he pulled his rig into the first safe lot he found, and sat there for a long time before he could make himself keep driving. Walt found out that evening, standing in his trailer with the radio on low and a can of soup going cold on the counter, because Ruth Bennett, who did not have his number, who had never met him, who only knew his first name from the things her grandson had told her over 2 years' worth of dinners, tracked down the miles for Reading office line and left a voicemail that cracked twice before she got through it. "Mr. Combs, my name's Ruth Bennett. I'm Malik's grandmother. He talks about you like you hung the moon. I don't know if you've heard, but the school's pulling your program, and they suspended my grandson 3 days over a fight he didn't start. And I think it's connected, I think it's all connected, to that man deciding what kind of family we are before he ever asked us a single question. I don't know what you can do. I just thought you should hear it from somebody who cares about that boy, same as you do, before you heard it some other way." Walt listened to it twice. Then he sat down at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten alone every night for 6 years, and he thought about a 9-year-old crossing a cafeteria nobody else would cross, unwrapping half a sandwich, saying, "You looked like you needed it." Like the matter was settled. And he thought about the robin pin on his vest, and the promise he'd made without quite meaning to make it, sitting in that same cafeteria 3 weeks earlier. "If one of ours needs backup, don't matter what for, the whole state shows up. We don't leave our people standing alone." He hadn't meant it as a plan. He'd meant it as the truth. But sitting at that table, he understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the truth had just become a plan, whether he'd intended it to or not. He called Ray Solano first. "I need the club," Walt said, when Ray picked up. "Not for me, for a kid. Talk to me." Walt told him everything. The cafeteria, the sandwich, the suspension. The way a 9-year-old had reached toward a stranger the whole room was scared of, and gotten his education taken as the answer. Ray was quiet for a long moment when he finished. "You know what you're asking for," Ray said finally. "You put the call out like that, it's not going to be 20 of us rolling by to make a point. You know how this state answers when it's for a kid." "I know." "You sure that's what you want? Because once it's out, Walt, I can't call it back small." Walt looked at the robin pin sitting on the table where he'd unclipped it to clean. Danny's bird. 6 years of carrying a weight that never got lighter, only easier to stand under. He thought about a boy who'd looked at him. Vest, tattoos, a table nobody would sit at, and seen someone who... Something, not someone, to be afraid of. Put it out, Walt said. Whatever it turns into, put it out. The message went out that night through the network the Iron Shepherds had spent 30 years building. A call that started with 6 chapters and, within 4 hours, had crossed county lines, then state lines, picked up by veterans' riding clubs, by a women's motorcycle ministry 2 hours south, by a Vietnam vets chapter that hadn't ridden together in a group larger than 15 in over a decade. The message that traveled wasn't, "Come make a scene." It was simpler than that, and it was the reason it traveled as fast and as far as it did. A 9-year-old boy shared his lunch with one of ours, when nobody else would sit with him. The school punished him for it. "We're riding to Kensington Elementary tomorrow morning, to make sure that boy knows exactly how many people have his back. Family only. No colors trouble. This is for a kid." Doreen Solano was the one who actually ran the phone tree that night, the way she'd run it for funerals and fundraisers and, once, a house fire that had left a member's family with nothing but the clothes they'd slept in. She didn't call it organizing. She called it making sure nobody has to carry it by themselves. And she worked the list the way she'd worked a school library circulation desk for 30 years. Methodical, unhurried, writing down every single yes in a spiral notebook she still kept, for no reason she could fully explain, except that it felt right to have a record. A retired steelworker 2 towns over, 71 years old, hadn't ridden with a group larger than 8 in 6 years since his hip surgery, and told Doreen he'd be there before she'd finished the sentence. A women's riding ministry 2 hours south rearranged an entire Saturday of planned fundraising to make the Wednesday morning instead. A Gulf War veterans chapter that hadn't answered a group call since a member's funeral the previous spring signed on almost as one. 4 different men texting back within the same 90 seconds. Each message some version of the same 4 words. For a kid, in... One writer, a grandmother of 6 who ran a diner counter by day, wrote back simply, "My grandbaby got moved out of gifted math last year over a form somebody didn't check twice. I'll be there at 5. By 6 the next morning, the number confirmed on Ray's radio net had passed 400. By 7, it was climbing past 500, and still coming. Malik didn't know any of it yet. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his good shirt. Ruth had insisted, even for a suspension day, "You carry yourself like the person you are, not the person somebody decided you'd be." Pushing eggs around a plate he didn't have much appetite for, when the sound started. It began as a low hum, distant, the kind of noise you register in your chest before your ears fully place it. Ruth heard it first, and went still at the stove. Malik heard it a second later and thought, at first, it was thunder, except the sky outside the kitchen window was clear, and hard, and blue. It kept building. By the time Ruth pulled the curtain back, the hum had become a sound with edges to it, a rolling wall of engines that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. And by the time she and Malik got to the front porch, still in his good shirt, still holding a fork he hadn't put down, the sound had become something neither of them had words for yet. They drove Malik to school that morning, not because he was supposed to be there. He was still suspended, technically, 1 more day left on it, but because Ruth had gotten a second voicemail at 5 that morning, this one just 4 words long. Walt's voice thick with something he didn't try to hide. "Come see this, Ruth." They came around the last corner onto the street that ran past Kensington Elementary, and Malik Bennett, 9 years old, quiet, watchful, a boy who had spent 2 years learning that the world took things away without warning and gave almost nothing back, looked out the car window and stopped breathing for a second. The street was gone. In its place was chrome and leather and steel as far as he could see in either direction. Motorcycles parked nose to tail along both curbs, 6 blocks of them, engines idling low in a rumble that Malik would later say he could feel in his teeth. Riders stood beside their bikes in loose, orderly lines, men and women, young and old, patches from a dozen different clubs, veterans' pins, a few riding alone, most in groups, all of them facing the school. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't loud in the way a crowd is loud. It was something closer to a wall, still and patient and enormous. 500 people who had gotten up before dawn and ridden, some of them 2 and 3 hours, because somebody had told them a 9-year-old boy needed to know he wasn't standing alone. News vans had already found it by 7:40. A local reporter was doing a live stand-up on the sidewalk, gesturing at the rows of motorcycles behind her, and school buses were slowing to a crawl as they approached, kids pressing their faces to the windows. And near the front steps, standing a full head taller than everyone around him, was Walt Combs, vest, boots, the robin pin catching the morning light, with his hand resting, gently, on the shoulder of a superintendent who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and had clearly not expected any of this, and who was, at that exact moment, in the middle of a very direct conversation with Grady Foss. Malik got out of the car before Ruth had even fully parked. He walked toward the school in his good shirt, small against the wall of chrome behind him, and Walt saw him coming and broke away from the conversation without a word, closing the distance in 6 long strides, and dropped to one knee in front of him right there on the sidewalk, in front of 500 riders and a news camera and a superintendent and Grady Foss himself. "You didn't have to do this," Malik said. His voice was doing something complicated, trying to be steady, not quite managing it. "Yeah, I did," Walt said. "You crossed a whole cafeteria for me when nobody else would look my way. You think I was going to let you sit alone, the one time it mattered most." He nodded past Malik, at the street. "Every single one of these people rode here because I told them what you did for me. That's it. That's the whole reason. Nobody made them come. They came because a 9-year-old showed them what it looks like to actually mean it when you say you won't leave somebody standing alone." Behind them, the reporter had turned her camera toward the 2 of them, and the superintendent, a careful, exhausted-looking woman named Diane Okafor who had been fielding calls since 6:15 that morning, walked over, with Grady Foss trailing a half-step behind her, his flat professional voice already reaching for a version of events that would make sense of what he was looking at. "Mrs. Bennett," Superintendent Okafor said, extending a hand to Ruth, who had just reached them. "I've asked Mr. Foss to walk me through the full record on your grandson's placement, the reassessment, and the suspension. I've read the lunch aid's statement. I'd like your permission to speak with you and Malik directly. This morning, before I make any decisions." "You're welcome to," Ruth said. "But I think the man standing next to you owes my grandson an answer first." All eyes turned to Foss. He looked, for the first time in 6 years inside that building, genuinely at a loss. The flat voice gone, the note-taking posture gone, 500 motorcycles, and a news camera having done in one morning what 2 office meetings and a written statement had failed to do: strip away every layer of procedure he'd been hiding behind, and leave him standing in front of the actual human beings his decisions had landed on. "I was following policy," he said, and even he seemed to hear how small it sounded. Malik looked up at him. He was 9 years old, and small, and standing in the shadow of a man who had suspended him for defending himself, and tried to take away the one friend who'd made him feel less alone since his mother died. And when he spoke, his voice didn't shake at all. "You checked a box on my file before you ever asked me a single question," Malik said. "You did it to me, and you did it to him." He nodded toward Walt without looking away from Foss. "But you were wrong, both times, and it took 500 people showing up on a Wednesday morning for you to have to hear it. That's not on us, Mr. Foss. That's on you." Nobody said anything for a long moment. The engines had gone quiet up and down the street, one by one, riders cutting them out of respect once they realized a kid was talking, until the only sound left was the wind off the lake and a boy's voice, calm and clear, and completely unafraid. Superintendent Okafor was the one who finally broke the silence. "Mr. Foss," she said, "I'll need your office key and your files. Effective this morning, you're on administrative leave pending a full review of placement and disciplinary decisions in this building, starting with this one, and going back as far as we need to." She turned to Ruth. "And Mrs. Bennett, Malik's suspension is rescinded, effective now, and I'll be personally reviewing his gifted cohort placement before the end of the day. I'm sorry it took this for anyone to actually look." A silver sedan pulled up hard against the curb a few minutes later, and a man in a golf jacket got out fast, taking in the 6 blocks of motorcycles and the news van with an expression that curdled by the second. Richard Kessler, Bradley's father, had gotten a call from a friend on the board 20 minutes earlier and driven straight over, already talking before his car door had finished swinging shut. "Diane, I need to know what's being said out here about my son. If there's some suggestion that Bradley—" "Richard." Superintendent Okafor didn't raise her voice, but something in it stopped him mid-sentence. "I've got a written aid statement from 2 weeks ago, flagging a comment your son made to Malik Bennett, filed and never acted on. I've got a second statement from Thursday, confirming Bradley initiated contact twice before anything happened in return. I'm not interested in relitigating your son's discipline on a sidewalk. I'm interested in why 2 separate warnings about him sat in a folder gathering dust while this boy," she nodded at Malik, "got suspended over defending himself. If you'd like to have that conversation, my office has an opening Monday. This morning isn't about you." Kessler opened his mouth, glanced at the news camera now angled squarely at him, and closed it again. He got back in his car without another word. Ruth watched him go, and felt something in her chest ease slightly. Not triumph exactly, just the small, specific relief of watching power finally answer to something instead of the other way around. Grady Foss did not lose his job that morning. He lost something slower and, in its own way, harder to sit with. 6 years of certainty. The district's review, which took most of that fall, turned up a pattern once someone finally went looking for it. A stack of disciplinary and placement decisions that broke, with uncomfortable consistency, along the same lines Ruth Bennett had named in his office weeks earlier, lines he had never once had to examine because no one had ever forced him to. He was reassigned that winter to a district administrative role with no direct student contact, a demotion in every way that mattered, and the district quietly rolled out a mandatory bias review process for placement decisions that teachers, 2 years later, still called the Bennett policy, whether or not anyone in the building remembered exactly why. Foss wrote Ruth a letter in November. It wasn't long, and it wasn't a performance. Ruth could tell the difference, she said later, because it didn't ask her for anything back. "I told myself for years that being consistent was the same thing as being fair." It read, in part, "I am only now understanding how much damage a person can do while telling themselves that story. I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted your grandson to know that someone finally heard him." Ruth kept the letter. She never showed it to Malik. Some doors, she decided, a boy shouldn't have to be the one to close. 6 months later, on a bright Saturday morning in April, the parking lot outside Kensington Elementary filled with motorcycles again. 40-some this time, not 500, parked in careful rows for the first annual Read and Ride Day, a partnership between the district and the Iron Shepherds that Superintendent Okafor had personally signed off on the week after Foss's reassignment. Kids lined up for turns sitting on parked bikes, helmets too big for their heads, while riders read picture books out loud from the front steps in voices roughened by decades of highway wind. Ruth had started something of her own that winter, a parent group she'd named the Open Door Council. 6 families at first, meeting in the church basement on Thursday nights to compare notes on placements, disciplinary records, and the specific, practiced ease with which paperwork could decide a child's future before anyone bothered to meet him. Priya's mother had joined in December, still furious and increasingly effective. After Dr. Reyes's follow-up review turned up a girl who'd been sitting in intervention for a stutter nobody had actually tested around. Same as Malik. Same folder-first mistake wearing a different kid's name. By spring, the district had adopted the review process everyone still called the Bennett policy, and Ruth kept a running list, in a notebook not unlike Doreen's, of every child it had already caught. Malik Bennett, 10 years old now, sat cross-legged at the front of the crowd of younger kids, a paperback open in his lap, waiting his turn to read. He'd been moved into the gifted literacy cohort the week after the review began, had finished the year 2 full grade levels ahead of where the intake form had once decided he'd stay, and had started, that spring, a small before-school reading circle for the second graders, still working through the same intervention room he'd once hidden a dragon book inside. Kids who reminded him, he told Mrs. Alvarez without quite meaning it as a big statement, of the empty seat he used to look for. Marcus Bennett had taken the weekend off his route for the first time in months to be there, standing near the steps with his arm around his mother's shoulders, watching his son read to a crowd of second graders like it was the easiest thing in the world. He'd told Ruth, quietly, over coffee that morning, that he was looking at routes closer to home. Nothing decided yet, but closer. Ruth hadn't pushed. She'd just squeezed his hand and let the thought sit there, taking root in its own time. Walt sat near the back, in a folding chair someone had set up for him, the robin pin catching the morning sun. Beside it, new, was a second pin, small, plain, an enamel outline of 2 hands set opposite each other, the kind of thing you had to know the story behind to understand. Ray had commissioned it that winter, quietly, and the club had voted, unanimously, to award it to exactly one honorary member, Malik Bennett, the only 9-year-old the Iron Shepherds had ever formally called one of their own. "You know," Walt said to him, as Malik took his seat to read to the crowd, "your mama's rule turned out bigger than either one of us figured." Malik looked down at the little pin on his own jacket, the one he wore now every single day, next to nothing else, because it didn't need company. "She always said everybody remembers who sat with them first," he said. "I don't think she knew how far it would go, though." "No," Walt agreed, watching a line of children waiting their turn on the motorcycles, watching Ruth Bennett laughing with a woman from the Veterans Riding Club 2 rows over, watching a building that had once tried to file a boy's whole future under a checked box, now standing wide open on a Saturday morning, with music playing and kids everywhere, and nobody, anywhere in sight, sitting alone. "I don't think any of us knew how far it would go,"